Do you think NASA's current Artemis lunar landing architecture is becoming a little too complex for its own good? With so many moving parts, there are also more opportunities for something to go wrong. That's why some experts are beginning to ask whether there might be simpler, and perhaps more importantly, safer ways to get astronauts back to the moon. So that's exactly what we'll explore today. From a different Spacex rocket to a fascinating lunar lander concept that NASA may have forgotten about, we'll look at several alternative ways of getting astronauts back to the moon. Then we'll compare them with NASA's current Artemis plans to answer an important question. Could these concepts help return Americans to the moon sooner while improving crew safety at the same time? Here's the problem. The current Artemis lunar landing plan is complicated. The basic idea sounds straightforward enough at first. A giant lunar lander, powered by super-cold liquid methane and liquid oxygen, launches into low Earth orbit. But before it can even think about heading to the moon, it has to be refueled by multiple tanker spacecraft. And that's where things start getting interesting. We're talking about moving huge amounts of ultra-cold liquid between vehicles floating in zero gravity while trying not to lose too much of it in the process. It's a bit like trying to pour a giant slushy from one moving truck into another moving truck while both are driving down the highway. Except the slushy is hundreds of degrees below zero, and the trucks are in space. Once the lander is finally fueled up, it heads toward the moon, spending about 5 days in transit before entering a special lunar orbit called NRHO. There it meets up with Orion, the spacecraft carrying the astronauts. The crew transfers over, and only then does the actual landing mission begin. From there, the lander has to descend from lunar orbit to the surface, support a week-long stay, launch back into orbit, return to NRHO, and dock with Orion again for the trip home. That's already a long list of things that need to go right. But there's another problem lurking in the background the entire time: boil-off. These propellants are so cold that they constantly want to warm up and turn into gas. That means the lander slowly loses fuel while sitting in Earth orbit, while flying to the moon, while waiting in lunar orbit, and even while parked on the lunar surface. The clock is basically running from the moment the fuel is loaded. As a result, every launch has to be carefully coordinated. Tankers need to arrive on time. Refueling needs to work perfectly. The transfer process needs to succeed. The lander needs to leave before too much fuel boils away. And all of this has to happen with remarkably little margin for error. Individually, none of these challenges is impossible. But when you stack them all together, the mission starts looking a bit like one of those giant domino setups. Every piece has to fall exactly as planned, because one mistake can ripple through the entire chain. And that's what makes some people nervous. There are simply a lot of points where things can go wrong. More importantly, when something does go wrong, the consequences aren't measured in delays or budget overruns. They could directly affect the astronauts, depending on that vehicle to get home. In the worst-case scenario, excessive propellant losses could leave a lander without enough fuel for a safe return from the lunar surface. That's not the kind of sentence anyone wants to see in a mission report. So once again, what we're really looking for is a better solution, perhaps even an entirely different lunar landing architecture, one that can significantly improve the crew's chances of survival when things don't go according to plan, whether that's a landing mishap, a system failure, or some other unexpected anomaly. Because if we're going to send humans back to the moon, it would be nice if getting them home wasn't dependent on every single domino staying upright. Now, if we're looking for ways to get Americans back to the moon sooner than the current Artemis timeline, there have actually been some surprisingly interesting proposals. And one of them involves a rocket that a lot of space fans already know and love. Honestly, I'm one of them too. Falcon Heavy. The basic idea is pretty simple. Instead of putting everything on one enormous rocket and hoping that rocket is available, you launch the pieces separately, assemble them in orbit, and then head for the moon. Think of it like buying furniture from IKEA. Instead of somehow fitting an entire house into one delivery truck, you send multiple boxes and put everything together when it arrives. Slightly less frustrating than IKEA, hopefully. One of the biggest advantages of this approach is that it avoids relying entirely on Starship HLS being ready on schedule. Starship could eventually become the most capable lunar vehicle ever built, but getting there requires mastering orbital refueling on a truly massive scale. Depending on whose estimates you use, a single lunar mission could require anywhere from 8 to 20 tanker launches before the vehicle can even leave Earth orbit. That's a lot of moving pieces. It's basically the spaceflight equivalent of needing 20 connecting flights just to get to your vacation destination. Falcon Heavy, meanwhile, already exists. It's already flying, and while it isn't as powerful as Starship on paper, sometimes having a vehicle that's available today beats having a more capable one that's still under development. The mission would begin by launching a lunar lander. Not Starship, not Blue Moon. Instead, the proposal calls for a relatively small Apollo-style lander developed specifically for the mission. The lander would weigh about 18 tons and be designed to support a surface stay of roughly 6.5 days. Most importantly, it would use hypergolic propellants, similar to those used during Apollo. Unlike super-cold methane and oxygen, these fuels can sit around for long periods without constantly boiling away. In other words, the spacecraft isn't slowly watching its return ticket evaporate while it's parked on the moon. For comparison, the Apollo 17 lunar module weighed around 16.5 tons, so this vehicle would only be slightly larger than the hardware that actually landed astronauts on the moon more than 50 years ago. Next comes the transportation system. 2 Falcon Heavy launches would place modified upper stages into low Earth orbit. The proposal assumes Falcon Heavy's partially reusable configuration, which can deliver roughly 54 tons to orbit per launch. One upper stage carries the lander. The second carries mostly fuel. After docking together, the stack would consist of the 18-ton lander, 2 modified upper stages weighing roughly 6 tons each, and about 90.8 tons of propellant. Altogether, the assembled vehicle would weigh approximately 120.8 tons in Earth orbit. That sounds like a lot, but getting to the moon is expensive from a fuel perspective. By the time the spacecraft performs both its trans-lunar injection burn and lunar orbit insertion burn, roughly 70 tons of propellant would already be gone. Fortunately, around 20.8 tons would still remain available once the vehicle reaches lunar orbit. And then the proposal takes a turn that feels almost suspiciously clever. Instead of throwing away the Falcon upper stages, it suggests landing them near the lunar South Pole. Normally, upper stages are treated like disposable packaging. They do their job and get discarded. Here, they're treated more like future real estate. Each stage would weigh around 6 tons dry and use approximately 5 tons of propellant for the landing. Additional modifications, such as stronger tanks, landing legs, and even windows, could be added before launch. The long-term idea is that these landed stages could eventually serve as storage depots, shelters, equipment sheds, or even the foundations of future lunar habitats. It's basically the first time somebody looked at a rocket stage and said, what if we keep the box instead of throwing it away? While all of this is happening, the actual lunar lander would remain parked safely in low lunar orbit, waiting for its crew. Only after the lander successfully arrives at the moon would astronauts launch aboard Orion. Because Orion weighs significantly more than the lander, at around 28 tons, it would require 3 Falcon Heavy launches instead of 2. Just like before, the upper stages would dock together in Earth orbit and provide enough propellant to send Orion toward the moon. Interestingly, the proposal argues that this architecture could actually send more crewed mass toward the moon than an SLS Block 2 launch. Once Orion reaches low lunar orbit, the mission starts looking very familiar. Orion docks with the waiting lander. 2 astronauts climb aboard and descend to the lunar surface. They spend roughly a week exploring the moon before launching back into orbit aboard the ascent stage. After docking with Orion once again, the crew transfers back, Orion performs the burn for Earth, and everyone heads home. There's another proposal that's arguably even more interesting, because instead of trying to make the lunar lander do everything, it asks a much simpler question. Why are we putting so many critical jobs into a single spacecraft in the first place? Think about the current Artemis approach. The same vehicle that lands astronauts on the moon is also responsible for getting them back off the moon. That's a bit like driving to a remote island on a single boat and then realizing that if the boat gets damaged when you arrive, you're suddenly living there permanently. The problem is that lunar landings are messy. They're one of the most difficult things humans do in space. Dust gets everywhere. Engines are firing close to the ground. Landing legs are absorbing huge loads. A lot can go wrong during those final few minutes. And if something does go wrong, the astronauts aren't just losing their ride to the surface, they could also be losing their ride home. So this alternative architecture takes a completely different approach. Instead of one spacecraft doing everything, the mission uses two separate vehicles. The first is a dedicated landing vehicle. Its only job is to get astronauts safely from lunar orbit down to the surface. That's it. It doesn't need to worry about launching back into space afterward. It just needs to stick the landing and keep the crew alive. Before astronauts ever leave Earth, a separate return vehicle is sent to the moon and lands on the surface ahead of time. It simply sits there, waiting. It's basically the lunar equivalent of parking an escape car at your destination before the road trip even begins. For the descent vehicle itself, a low-slung design makes a lot of sense. And honestly, if we're looking for an existing concept that already checks most of the boxes, the APACA Lander is probably the closest thing we've got. APACA, short for Autonomous Logistics Platform for All-Moon Cargo Access, was proposed by Dynetics during NASA's Human Landing System competition back in 2020 and 2021. It ultimately lost out to SpaceX's Starship HLS, but that doesn't mean it was a bad idea. In fact, for a safety-focused architecture like the one we're discussing, it may actually be a better fit. The biggest advantage is its extremely low center of gravity. Unlike Starship, which is basically a flying skyscraper trying to land on the moon, APACA keeps most of its mass close to the surface. That's a huge benefit when you're landing in the rough terrain of the lunar South Pole. If one landing leg sinks into soft regolith, or the vehicle touches down on an uneven slope, a short, wide lander is simply much harder to tip over. It's the difference between standing on a step stool and standing on a dining table. Crew access is also much simpler. Astronauts are already close to the ground, so they can just walk down a short ramp. No giant elevators, no complicated access systems. And as every engineer eventually learns, every extra mechanism is just another thing waiting to break at the worst possible moment. The design also provides better emergency escape options. Because the vehicle is short and wide, you can place multiple hatches around the cabin. If the lander ends up tilted after touchdown, chances are at least one exit remains usable. Most importantly, this architecture doesn't require the descent vehicle to be lightweight. Since the ascent vehicle is completely separate, the descent stage can be wider, heavier, stronger, and more stable. The goal is no longer squeezing every kilogram out of the design. The goal is to keep the crew alive. Now, does it have to be APACA? Not at all. What really matters is a low center of gravity, a wide landing footprint, multiple escape routes, and a vehicle dedicated solely to landing. APACA just happens to be the closest real-world design that already embodies those principles. The cool thing about this approach is that if the landing vehicle develops a serious problem after touchdown, the mission isn't automatically over. Maybe a landing leg collapses. Maybe a power system fails. Maybe communications stop working. Maybe the vehicle tips over after landing and suddenly looks like a very expensive lawn chair. Under the current architecture, any of those situations could become a major emergency because the damaged vehicle is also supposed to take the astronauts back to orbit. With the two-vehicle approach, the crew has options. As long as they can safely reach the pre-positioned return vehicle, they still have a path home. Space is exciting, but it's also dangerous. During Apollo, the United States was willing to accept extraordinary levels of risk in order to win the space race. Today, NASA faces much greater pressure to protect astronauts' lives. Moon landings will probably be safer thanks to better computers, sensors, testing methods, engineering tools, and decades of experience. But we won't truly know how much safer they are until astronauts actually start landing on the moon again. So, Regardless of whether these alternative approaches make the most sense technically or economically, if they can improve the odds of keeping our explorers safe as they venture into the vast unknown, then they're worth seriously considering.